Have you ever asked yourself why, despite being praised as a gifted child, maybe even called brilliant, you now feel like someone who somehow missed the mark? You remember the awards, the proud teachers, the parents who told you the sky wasn't even the limit. But now, as an adult, what do you see? Frustration, stagnation, a quiet, gnawing sense that you've not only disappointed others, but more painfully, yourself. If this feels familiar, and this video is for you, and no, you are not alone. You're not broken. You're just one of the few brave enough to see through the illusion. If you've ever felt like your intelligence became more of a burden than a gift, subscribe now. Because we're about to explore why brilliance often leads to isolation and what you can do about it. Because the world never nurtured brilliance. It rewards functionality, not depth. And being functional is very different from being exceptional. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "The greater the intelligence, the deeper the pain." Maybe now you're starting to understand what he meant. The pain isn't because you think too much. It's because most people don't think at all. And that is where your story begins. From a very young age, you were told you were different. Not just bright, but gifted. Your ability to absorb knowledge quickly, your sharp perception, your curious questions, they made you stand out. And in the eyes of adults, that difference wasn't just noticed, it was celebrated. You weren't just a child. You were the prodigy, the one who would go far. Every compliment became a prophecy. Every achievement, a signal that something rare, something exceptional, was unfolding. But what no one ever told you, perhaps because they didn't know, is that this praise was also the beginning of a trap. You see, early recognition can feel like a blessing, but it quietly turns into a prison. One where your value becomes tied not to who you are, but to what you produce and how quickly you impress. The label of gifted isn't just a description. It's a contract, a silent agreement that says, so long as you keep being brilliant, you are worthy. The moment you fall short, struggle, simply stop impressing, everything begins to quietly unravel. And so you learn, very early on, that love, respect, and approval are conditional. You are admired for being extraordinary, but never taught how to be ordinary. You're expected to shine, but never shown how to rest in the dark. That pressure builds in silence. The fear of disappointing others, and eventually yourself, becomes a constant undercurrent. Not a motivator, but a weight. A weight that makes you procrastinate, overthink, avoid. Because when only greatness is expected, any action that falls short of perfection feels like failure. And so you wait. You delay. You plan, but never begin. Until, eventually, you're no longer the child genius. You're the adult disappointment. And that's where the real fracture begins. The person you became was shaped not by your essence, but by the expectations projected onto you. Carl Jung called this projection the persona, the social mask we learn to wear in order to be loved, praised, and accepted. As a gifted child, your persona was built early, not around your vulnerabilities or needs, but around your ability to amaze. You became what others wanted to see, and the better you played the part, the harder it became to take the mask off. But what happens when the world stops applauding? What happens when the mask begins to crack? We see this in the tragic story of William James Sidis, a name many have forgotten. But in the early 20th century, Sidis was hailed as the smartest boy in America. He entered Harvard at 11. His IQ was estimated to be among the highest ever recorded. He was expected to become a world-changing genius. But Sidis rejected the spotlight. He lived in obscurity. He worked menial jobs. He avoided attention, rejected fame, and died in isolation. Not because he lacked brilliance, but because the world around him never cared about the human being behind the mind, only the myth. And when that myth no longer served a purpose, it was discarded. How many gifted children grow into adults carrying that same wound, that same disillusionment? The tragedy is not the loss of potential. It's the quiet erasure of self. Because when your sense of self is built on constant applause, absence doesn't feel quiet. It feels like annihilation. This is the shadow side of early praise. It convinces you that your worth is tied to your performance. That if you are not exceptional, you are nothing. But you were never taught how to fail. You were never told that genius doesn't guarantee direction, or fulfillment, or even peace. So now, as an adult, you look around and wonder, how did this happen? Where did that spark go? And more hauntingly, was I ever truly special? Or was it all just a story others told me, so they could feel inspired for a moment? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because until you confront the myth, you cannot understand the silence that came after it. And that silence, that painful stillness inside, is not failure. It is the beginning of something real. Because when the applause fades, you can finally hear your own voice. And the question now is this: what does that voice truly want to say? Arthur Schopenhauer believed that human life is driven not by logic, not even by the pursuit of happiness, but by a blind, relentless force he called the will. It is irrational. It is insatiable. It doesn't seek meaning. It simply wants to exist, to continue, to assert itself. And in most people, this will manifest in ordinary desires, comfort, recognition, survival. But for those born with high intelligence, the will often mutates. It doesn't settle for survival. It demands significance. It doesn't want to live. It wants to transcend. You weren't just trying to be good enough. You were trying to be unforgettable, to justify your existence through impact, through mastery, through legacy. But what began as a gift, an extraordinary capacity for thought, slowly transformed into an unforgiving judge. You became your own harshest critic, measuring every thought, every plan, every action against a standard no human could meet consistently. Perfectionism put on the costume of discipline, and procrastination hid behind the mask of readiness. And the more potential you saw in yourself, the more paralyzed you became in the face of it. Because to someone wired for depth, nothing ever feels complete enough. Nothing feels worthy enough. And so, you hesitate. You spiral. You wait for the perfect moment, which never comes. Kierkegaard once wrote that despair is not simply suffering. It is the agony of being unable to become oneself. And that is the hidden crisis of the gifted adult. The will demands greatness, but the self is suffocating under the pressure to deliver it. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, though vastly different in style, agree on something. Few are willing to say aloud that too much consciousness, too much clarity, can become a burden. Few are prepared to carry, because when you see everything, the emptiness of rewards, the shallowness of success, the illusions behind social games, it's no longer possible to pursue them with blind enthusiasm. Others move forward with ease, precisely because they are not questioning the road they're on. But your mind interrogates every turn. Every step becomes a debate. And while others are building, you are thinking too much, too far, too deeply. And so, the will doesn't vanish. It just turns inward. It becomes a quiet torment. It whispers that you're falling behind, even though the race was never yours to begin with. And yet, you still feel it. The pressure to produce something brilliant, to validate the label you were given long ago. But here's the truth. Your suffering is not weakness. It is the cost of lucidity. It's the internal war that erupts when a deep mind keeps crashing against a shallow world. What you're feeling isn't failure. It's misalignment. Your mind was never lacking in light. It's simply been searching for something worthy to illuminate. And so, the question is not whether you've lost your talent. The question is whether you've ever been allowed to define it on your own terms. Until now, your will has been shaped by others, by applause, by expectation, by pressure to impress. But what would happen if that will became your own, not driven by the need to be extraordinary, but by the quiet desire to be whole? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because the moment you stop chasing brilliance and start reclaiming authorship over your life, the paralysis begins to break. Not all at once, but slowly, steadily, like light returning to a room that was never truly dark, only waiting for the door to be opened. When a child is constantly told they're brilliant, they don't just build confidence, they build identity. Their sense of self becomes fused with achievement, with applause, with the need to be exceptional. But what happens when that child becomes an adult and the applause stops? What happens when intelligence no longer opens doors, when insight is no longer celebrated, but quietly dismissed? This is where the collapse begins. What once set you apart, your sharp thinking, your depth, your clarity, now feels like a burden. Because the adult world doesn't run on brilliance. It runs on reliability, on repetition, on playing the game. In school, you were praised for asking better questions. At work, you're rewarded for asking fewer. In childhood, you stood out. In adulthood, standing out often means being left out. The very traits that made you shine now make you different. And not in the way people admire, but in the way they avoid. As the world stops recognizing your potential, you start questioning whether it was ever real. This is where the gifted identity begins to fracture. In psychology, there's a term for this identity foreclosure. When your sense of self forms too early, built on external praise and fixed labels, leaving little room to grow or to change. You didn't just develop as a person, you were cast in a role. and you played it well. So well. In fact, that no one ever asked if you wanted to. But eventually, the script runs out. And life asks for something else. Resilience, humility, emotional presence, skills you were never taught because the spotlight was always on your intellect. And when that spotlight fades, what remains isn't clarity, it's silence. You start to notice the ones who were never called gifted are now thriving, steady, fulfilled, content. They were allowed to become ordinary. That freedom was never offered to you. You, who once lit up the room, now shrink from it. Not because you lack light, but because the world stopped reflecting it back. It's a strange grief, because what you lost wasn't just opportunity, it was identity. And in its place comes a quieter kind of pain. Not rejection, but indifference. Schopenhauer once wrote, "The wise are always alone, because when you see through the illusions, the false promises, the shallow goals, the performance of everyday life, you also see how little space there is for those who don't play along. You don't just feel misunderstood, you feel misaligned. And so you withdraw. You skip reunions. You dread small talk. You avoid comparisons with the people who were once considered average, but who now seem, ironically, at peace. And underneath all of it, there is shame. Shame that you didn't live up to the story. Shame that maybe you never really were that story to begin with. But here's what no one tells you. The most painful part isn't the failure. It's the realization that no one's paying attention anymore. Not because you disappointed them, but because they were never really watching you. They were watching what you represented. And when that image fades, so does their interest. And in the end, the only applause left is the one you never gave yourself. And this is the turning point. Because when the noise dies down, you can finally hear the real question beneath it all. Who are you without the performance? That question may feel heavy, but it's not your end. It's your beginning. And to answer it, we have to look deeper. Not just at you, but at the world that was never ready for what you really are. That's where we go next. The tragedy is not that society rejects genius. It's that it resists what genius represents. Because intelligence, real intelligence, doesn't just illuminate, it disrupts. A gifted mind doesn't just perform well, it sees clearly. It asks uncomfortable questions. It notices what others would rather ignore. And in a world built on convenience, depth is rarely welcome. Because depth requires time. It requires reflection. And most of all, it requires the courage to admit that things may not be as they seem. Schopenhauer understood this. He wrote that what gains attention in the world is not the wisest, but the most convenient. And today, that's more true than ever. We live in an age where a 7-second video can reach more people than an idea that took 7 years to develop, where performance is rewarded over perception, and visibility matters more than insight. You're not ignored because your thoughts lack value. You're ignored because they take longer to digest than the world is willing to give. In this environment, brilliance isn't just overlooked. It's seen as a threat. Because every gifted individual is a mirror that reflects back what others don't want to see. Your questions force people to confront their assumptions. Your clarity makes their confusion visible. Your presence, even when silent, challenges the illusion that everything is fine. And that's precisely why society grows uncomfortable around you. Not because it doesn't recognize your depth, but because it does. You don't fit neatly into trends. You don't repeat what's already been said. And you don't play the role that makes others feel more secure in their ignorance. Nietzsche saw this, too. He believed that society prefers comforting lies to difficult truths, that people would rather hear what affirms them than what awakens them. And so, the deeper you go, the quieter the world becomes. Not because you've disappeared, but because you're now speaking a language it doesn't want to learn. You begin to notice that it's not your ideas that are too complex. It's that the world has stopped caring to understand them. And so, the brilliant retreat. Not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. You pull away not because you think you're better, but because you're tired of having to explain what no one is really listening to. This withdrawal isn't weakness. It's self-preservation. It's not withdrawal. It's the only sane response to a world that treats depth as danger and insight as interference. But here's the cost. The more the world resists depth, the more those who carry it begin to doubt themselves. You begin to wonder, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I've overestimated my value. Maybe I've misunderstood what this world needs. And in that doubt, something dangerous begins to take root. The belief that your clarity has no place, that your voice has no home. But let's be honest, if society does not value depth, then why keep offering yourself to it? Why continue to search for recognition from a culture that cannot see you? This is where the real question emerges, one that goes deeper than self-doubt. If the world is no longer a place where you can be seen as you are, then where do you go? Where does a brilliant mind go to be understood? Not for what it produces, but for what it perceives. That question marks the beginning of a new kind of path, one that does not depend on being seen, but on learning to see yourself clearly and fully, without distortion. And that is exactly where we go next. By now, you may realize this journey was never about becoming the gifted child again. That image was never meant to last. It was an ideal projected onto you. And like all ideals, it cracked the moment it collided with reality. The pain you carry today is not just from unmet potential. It's from living in a world that taught you to equate your worth with your brilliance. And when the brilliance dimmed, so did your sense of self. But maybe that was never your failure. Maybe it was the failure of a system that values performance over presence. A culture that praised your talent, but never taught you how to be human. And now, in this quiet space where old identities dissolve, a new opportunity appears. Not to rebuild a genius, but to meet yourself as you are. Schopenhauer believed that suffering is not an accident. It's an essential part of existence, not as punishment, but as a teacher. The more clearly you see life, the more suffering you will inevitably encounter. But through that suffering comes clarity. Because pine strips away illusion. It forces you to face what remains when the labels fall away. And what remains isn't your resume. It isn't your potential. It's your presence. But that presence must be reclaimed. It must be nurtured, consciously, patiently, deliberately. So how do you begin? Not by chasing grand solutions, not by forcing transformation, but by stepping away from the obsession with greatness and toward the depth of being. Start by letting go of the belief that you need to do something extraordinary to justify your existence. You don't. The pressure to prove yourself, to constantly achieve, impress, and exceed is not your true voice. It's a script you were handed, and you're allowed to set it down. Accept that you are, in many ways, ordinary, and that this ordinariness is not a flaw. It is part of your freedom. Let yourself slow down. Journal, not to analyze yourself, but to hear yourself. Meditate, not to escape, but to sit quietly with what is. Walk without a destination. Breathe without an agenda. Create something, not for an audience, but for your own joy. Because the goal is no longer to become exceptional. The goal is to become integrated. To come home to the parts of yourself that were buried beneath pressure, perfectionism, and praise. You were conditioned to chase brilliance. But now, you're invited to cultivate wholeness. And that shift, though subtle, is profound. You don't need to be great. You just need to be real. Because authenticity is not found in achieving more. It's found in resisting the need to perform at all. This is the paradox. The very thing you feared, being unseen, being ordinary, becomes the soil where real selfhood can finally take root. And from that soil, clarity grows. Not the clarity that leads to fame or recognition, but the kind that allows you to live with yourself. Fully, honestly, without apology. This is not a return to what you once were. It's a turning toward what you've always been, beneath the noise, beneath the labels, beneath the brilliance. A self not defined by light, but by depth, by presence, by peace. And if the world never sees it, that's okay, because you will. And now, the question shifts from how do I impress them to what do I truly value? That question is the start of your next chapter. Not a reinvention, but a remembering. And that's what we'll explore in the final message. There comes a moment when brilliance no longer needs to perform, when the applause fades, and all that's left is the quiet echo of what you used to be. But in that silence, something else emerges. Not the noise of praise, but the signal of truth. Because when talent goes quiet, truth finally speaks. And it says this: you were never meant to shine for them. You were meant to survive yourself. Maybe your light no longer burns with the same brilliance, but in its softened glow, you found a way through darkness that no one else even saw. And that is the silent gift. If this spoke to a part of you no one sees, subscribe and leave a comment below, because someone else out there is still wondering if anyone understands. Not just as a reply to a video, but as a small act of healing for someone else scrolling in silence, looking for a sign. And if you're ready to stop chasing the myth of who you were, the next videos will help you begin again. Not by restoring your legend, but by rebuilding your soul from the pieces left behind. Your worth was never in your brilliance. It was always in your being. And that being doesn't need applause to exist. It just needs you to finally come home to it.